Today's episode is with Rachel Menzies from the University of Sydney in the School of Psychology, and we're talking death anxiety. It's so fascinating to look at it, in particular how it relates to health anxiety, social anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and the like. I think you're going to really enjoy this one. Also, please make sure you go out and subscribe if you like this. I know it's going to bring a lot of value, and I'm really going to be appreciative if you're able to share that with everyone else.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
It's great to have Rachel Menzies from the University of Sydney here on Better Thinking podcast. Today we'll be talking about death anxiety. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me, Nesh.
It's great to have you here. Now, look, I think the first question that comes to mind is, before we get into obviously the article that you wrote and looking at those studies that you wrote about, what got you into looking at death and death anxiety? Where does that interest come from?
I think it's something I've always been interested in. My background, I've got obviously a degree in psychology, but I also I majored in ancient history. And I think it was something that I'd noticed during that aspect of my degree that was kind of prevalent across human history in ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. So it sort of started coming up to me as this kind of universal, pervasive theme across different cultures, different times of history. And then I guess I started to think about it more in the context of psychology, and the links just started coming up there for me. So it was kind of those two combined interests in ancient history and then also more recently linking that in with psychology that I think made me really interested in the pervasive universal role that fears of death have for us as a species.
It's interesting that there's so many references in history about death. You know that clearly it's been around forever. The fact that we're born also goes out and lets us know very much that we're going to die as well. It's kind of at the centre.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look as far back as even 4,000 years ago, this theme of being aware of our own mortality and conscious of that and terrified of that has been around literally across the last 4,000 years.
Just thinking out aloud, do you think it would be a bit different, 3,000 years ago, someone whose maybe life expectancy was maybe in their 30s versus today where we might be closer to, in our 80s in, Western countries? Do you think that would have also played out differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I guess aspects of it would be different, but I suppose the people who tended to be writing about death and fears of death, because they were the people who were literate and well-educated, tended to be the ones who would have had a longer life expectancy anyway. But I think there probably would be different aspects to it then compared to now, but certainly that kind of central theme seems common.
Yeah. I imagine, if I was going to die in my 30s somewhere, I wouldn't have too much time to reflect on it that way. Thinking about, what my 20s I was thinking about wasn't too much about death, right? It was about going out and partying and socializing and what I'm doing at uni. It's a very, very different world than what it might have been like if that was kind of where illness would usually strike and you'd become unwell and die. And I don't know if it was 30s, but making some assumptions there.
Yeah, much younger. Yeah, no, definitely. It's a totally different way of living, I guess.
Yeah. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about the article that you wrote, Death Anxiety, the Worm at the Core of Mental Health. It's a very intriguing title. How did you come up with that title, and tell us a little bit about the article?
Yeah, so William James coined that title. So the famous, psychologist, religious theorist, he argued that death anxiety is the worm at the core of all of our existence, that it is that kind of underlying fear that pervades our day-to-day living. So that's where that term came from. The article itself really was one of the first articles to kind of argue that across different mental health conditions, death anxiety seems prominent, in some conditions more directly or more obviously than others. But even in conditions where you might be more surprised to see death anxiety coming up, like social anxiety, for example, social phobia, there does seem to be both theoretically and then also empirically from, empirical experimental studies, this link between mental health and fears of death. So that was the first article we wrote that really kind of set that idea off. It's not a new idea. Freud talked about similar things. But I guess it was making this broader claim that so many different mental health conditions come back to that underlying fear.
Yeah, it's fascinating to consider it in that way. I know that some of the conditions or experiences that you mentioned in the article, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and obviously social anxiety, that common theme, that common element plays into this understanding of death or fear of death. Can you maybe talk about that link? Well, what is it that we're all scared about death?
I think for different people, it can be different aspects. So a lot of questionnaires or measures of fears of death, they break it up into different kind of subcategories. So things like fear of the dying process. So things like, pain, loss of cognitive function associated with dying. But then there are other aspects like the fear of death of a loved one. So some people might be relatively not happy, but not thrilled, but, content and accepting of their own death, but it's the death of their loved ones that they find particularly terrifying or difficult.
In terms of if one of their loved ones was dying, or how their loved one would be after they die.
Yeah. Both.
Both.
Yeah, fears of the impact of their own death on loved ones, but also fears of losing a loved one themselves. So I think different people can have this fear in different ways. For other people, it's things to do with fearing an afterlife or this kind of fear of the unknown, what might happen after they die. So I think it manifests for different people in different ways, but has this kind of central fear at the heart of all of that.
And so what are some of the ways, maybe I'll share as well from my perspective and from my clients, what are some of the ways in which a client would present with a fear of death? How might they kind of look in a session?
Yeah, so a handful of clients might present, and I know I've had some clients that will present and quite directly and openly say that it's death they're scared of. But for a lot of people, it's kind of presenting and manifesting in a less obvious direct way. So for example, people with OCD, say if it's the washing subtype of OCD, they'll talk about, excessively washing their hands because of fears of some kind of germs that are going to lead to some kind of serious illness. So that's, I guess, one example of where they might not be verbalizing that fear of death, but they're explicitly saying, I'm doing this behavior to prevent this illness. Or with other conditions like panic disorder, people might talk about worrying about heart attacks, frequently visiting cardiologists. In the somatic symptom disorders like illness anxiety, patients will excessively, seek medical reassurance, go to different medical specialists, seek a second opinion, excessively worry about different bodily symptoms that could be a sign of poor health. So those are, I guess, a handful of examples. Of course, in things like the specific phobias, where people commonly worry about things like heights, water, snakes, spiders, all of those things we have an evolutionary reason to fear because they can all directly lead to death. So I think sometimes people might not come in talking about it as being a fear of death, but you only have to kind of scratch beneath the surface to see what's driving a lot of people's verbally reported fears.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even sickness, the fear of being sick, the fear of getting unwell, is so commonly, at least from my experience, I've seen lots of clients who have been worried about, I might get sick if I eat from a restaurant, for
Yeah.
example, and I'm not sure how they handle food. And it's not that they're saying I'm scared of dying by any means. They're going out and just saying I'm having trouble eating socially with my friends, and it takes a bit of time to appreciate, what's actually below that, and understand, can it be verbalized that that's what it is, rather than kind of just staying as I just feel uncomfortable sort of eating because it's, I feel the preparation wasn't up to scratch.
Yeah, exactly right. So again, it's kind of, looking for what's actually going on, at the heart of those fears and what's not being said perhaps in the room. And I think it's not uncommon for, with a bit of probing and a bit of questioning about that, for people to recognize and admit, that is my underlying fear. Because often, they can say with contamination concerns, like you've mentioned, it is that pervasive across the board. And of course, if you're worried about germs and illness, then there's clearly a direct link there to the death that could result of that illness.
And that's where reassurance ends up playing in to avoid this apprehensive feeling of I've just eaten something, I'm not feeling quite well, I'm feeling a bit nauseous in my stomach, I might be getting a little bit, hotter in temperature. So I'm not kind of feeling at my best. I best go to a GP, my doctor, have a chat to make sure I'm okay, and maybe seek some antibiotics or some sort of thing. And if I get reassurance from my doctor, then that reduces my anxiety, and so I feel better, but only to kind of experiencing that again tomorrow or the next week.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is that the revolving door type of scenario that you talk about, that it's either a revolving door, or maybe I'll let you explain what you mean by, I think there was a reference in the article about a revolving door.
Yeah, so the revolving door, I guess, is just a way to think about the fact that typically clients don't just present with one diagnosis and receive treatment for that diagnosis and then are fine for the rest of their life. Commonly, people will present with one thing, receive, say panic disorder, receive treatment for panic disorder, maybe a few years are fine, then they might present with something that looks different on the surface, like OCD, receive treatment for OCD, and possibly, come back a few years later with again something that looks different on the surface. So, and this is backed up by lots of studies, including my own research, showing that the average number of lifetime diagnoses is significantly higher than people's current diagnoses. So in some of my studies, the average lifetime diagnosis was about 3. So suggesting that whereas the current diagnosis might have been 1. So it seems like there is this tendency for people to kind of receive treatment for something at one point in their life, but then manifest something that looks different later on. So in terms of the revolving door, it's this idea that if we're only treating the surface level symptoms or condition, if we're treating the kind of current flavor of the day with someone's presentation and not addressing that underlying root cause, then of course people are going to keep presenting with different things and keep kind of cycling through different symptoms, even within a disorder. So even within something like OCD, it's not uncommon for someone to start off with the washing subtype, start off excessively concerned about contamination and germs, but then for that to kind of shift sometimes over weeks to compulsive checking. So again, suggesting that treating that symptom is not going to be enough. It's not going to be as effective as treating that underlying cause.
Because it might be that you work with a client to do some exposure work or systematic desensitization with some hand washing or reducing hand washing, making them more comfortable. However, after they're able to kind of manage that a little bit more effectively, we might find that they're checking the stove more often in case of, it was left overnight and it started a fire and we all burnt to death, in our sleep type scenario.
That's exactly right.
It shifts, it moves.
Yeah, that's right. So maybe, I have the washing subtype of OCD. My therapist has helpfully explained to me, the role of the immune system, and we've done some ERP about hand washing. So that's all calmed down. I know that I'm unlikely to get sick from unwashed food, for example. But of course, I know that just because I won't die from that doesn't mean I can't die from a fire or a household invasion or electrocution. So then I'm sort of desperately looking for any other way to control the inevitable outcome of my own death, or the death of, my family, anyone else in the household, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I know I speak with my clients quite a lot when we're looking at anxiety, and really any form of anxiety, in that it's almost like a liquid, in that it will go out and find the path of least resistance. It'll find a crack somewhere, and so if we plug one hole, it will tend to go out and try and find another area. So particularly with a health anxiety type of concern and worry, if someone can feel as though they get a handle on, I'm not going to wash my hands and not worry about the germs in making me unwell, if we go out and cover that, someone might notice a twinge in their back that all of a sudden might be the latest tumor, or some type of horrific, horrible sort of illness that's going to lead to death, or severe problems in their life. And so it keeps moving. It's almost a morphing experience.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that makes sense. If there's something else going on there underneath, of course it's going to keep morphing, and one anxiety is going to bleed into another if that underlying root cause hasn't been addressed.
Yeah. As you say, the evolutionary response is to stay alive, and so it just keeps going out. And in some sense, we want it to be there, in that to be vigilant to a point, or be aware, but not hyper vigilant, so that it every itch becomes something more sinister.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it seems like there's a kind of, I guess, a bell curve or a spectrum of fears of death, and some people that are on that higher end, it seems like they're going to manifest with these kind of mental health conditions. But of course, then there are people on the lower end where perhaps they don't have enough fear of death, where they're, doing a lot of risky behaviors, skydiving, that kind of high adrenaline type activities. So it does seem like there is a kind of continuum of it, and to be at either end perhaps isn't particularly helpful.
No, absolutely. I was just watching a documentary recently called Free Solo, with a gentleman, Alex is his first name. I don't know I can't remember his surname. Climbs mountains, and particularly a particular one in Yosemite National Park in the States. And he does it without ropes. It's free solo. So, but they put him in an MRI and looked at his amygdala response, and his amygdala response doesn't act like our amygdala response. It tends to kind of sit still and be quite content, when ours would be kind of alerted and alarmed. It's fascinating to kind of look at it in that way. Is that a lot of these free solo climbers unfortunately end up falling to their death, because they are clearly going out and doing risky behaviours, that are literally life-threatening, or quite regularly. So, as you say, we kind of need that for survival.
Yeah, definitely. We've evolved to have that for a reason. So to a certain extent, it does have a protective or safety function. But of course, if it's on that higher end, like anything, any kind of anxiety on that higher end is going to start to have a negative impact on us. Yeah.
Moving across to treatments, because obviously there's going to be different ways in looking at this, and we've spoken about what's that kind of a surface level experience of, let's say, hand washing, or checking, in an obsessive compulsive sort of manner, through to the deeper, being the core. It's actually related to this fear of dying, fear of death. What are the sort of proposed sort of treatment ideas, models that you're kind of putting forward in terms of what we could do about that, whether whether we're clinicians or, whether we ourselves are experiencing that, for our listeners?
Yeah, so, like with any anxiety, I guess exposure we know is one of the most evidence-based effective treatments. So I published a meta-analysis last year looking at any studies, any RCTs that had looked at reducing death anxiety in participants, and CBT came out as being, they're on a heap of studies looking at that, but CBT came out as being significantly more effective at reducing fears of death compared to control conditions and compared to other therapies. And the CBT procedures that were used in those studies focused on graded exposure, systematic desensitization to thoughts of death, images of death, that kind of thing. So that's I guess the most evidence-based treatment we have for it, although of course there haven't been any studies done looking at reducing fears of death among people with a mental health condition. So currently, for the last part of my PhD, I'm developing an online treatment looking at using CBT principles to help reduce people's fears of death. So in terms of, I guess, how that works or what that looks like, it's kind of typical CBT procedures in terms of, firstly, exposing people to thoughts of death, reminders of death. So for a lot of people, I think for all of us, not just people with mental health conditions, our tendency is to avoid. So if we have a thought of death, we push it away. Some people might avoid walking past cemeteries or funeral homes, trying to kind of deny our own mortality, I think, a lot of the time. So the first aspect of the treatment then is really just reintroducing people to this, whether that's through watching films about death, reading novels with characters who are dying, even reading kind of cartoons about death or sort of funny books about it. So all of that would come under that exposure approach. But then there's also this idea of trying to change our beliefs about death and our attitudes towards it. So starting to kind of challenge perhaps some of our assumptions about death and changing our perspective on it. So, for example, that could involve looking at other historical views on death. So things like I'm quite a fan of the Stoics, the ancient Greek and Roman Stoic philosophers, who talk a lot about this idea of accepting death, responding to death neutrally, neither welcoming it nor pushing it away. And really, it's also quite a kind of Buddhist technique as well, this idea of continually reminding ourselves of our own mortality. So each day almost reflecting on this and using that to help us actually live a better life in the process. So, there are obvious benefits to reminding ourselves that our time here is finite. And there are a couple of good apps and things that can help with that as well. So there's the app WeCroak, which is really popular, which sends you reminders throughout the day that you're going to die. There's a newer app called Finite, which seems quite good. I've just downloaded it. But yeah, the general treatment approach is really exposure, but also starting to challenge our beliefs about death. So viewing it as something natural, something that can actually help us live better lives if we embrace it and accept that.
I started to chuckle while you were talking about that in thinking about an app that gives me a notification. You're going to die.
Yeah, but it sounds ridiculous, but sometimes it comes up at great moments. Like if I'm about to do, I don't know, if I'm running late for an appointment or something, or I'm stuck in traffic, and then I have this notification come up on my phone. Is that useful kind of reminder of, okay, put this in perspective. How bad is an extra 10 minutes stuck in traffic? Is it worth getting upset about? It does make for an interesting conversation starter when it lights up at a dinner or, out at drinks and someone sees that come up on your phone. But I do think there is a really useful quality to that. There's a reason why Buddhist monks and the Buddhist tradition for so long has embraced this idea of every single day scheduling and making time to sit down and when I say reflect on your death, I'm not talking about a reminder on your phone. In the Buddhist tradition, it's sitting down and visualizing your corpse decaying for, 10, 20, 30 minutes, which isn't something I practice daily, but there are lots of cultures across time that have really embraced this idea of, how different would our life be if we truly accepted and reminded ourselves that we don't have much time on this earth. How different would our interactions be with people, with our loved ones, with strangers, if we really kept that in mind? So I guess that's kind of, a bit of information about CBT treatment, but also just generally, I think, how using the same kind of principles can help us in our day-to-day life as well.
There's a common theme as well that you mentioned, not only in our conversation, but in your article as well, which is very much around acceptance. The cultivating an experience or a relationship with death, that we accept death as part of our world. And you offered three ideas, one being escape acceptance, kind of embracing death as a welcome escape from suffering that we experience in life. So we escape the suffering. The other one was approach acceptance. So accepting death due to one's beliefs about the existence of an afterlife, probably more potentially spiritual or a religious type of perspective. But you're approaching death in that way and accepting it. And then the last one was a neutral acceptance, accepting death as a natural part of life and just embracing it and recognizing it's out of our control. And I think from my memory, the neutral acceptance had the most efficacy out of the three, but all were useful ways in kind of approaching, in some sense, it's like different ways of relating with death, being comfortable again with death.
Yeah, that's right. So all three seem to have some, benefit, but it's that neutral acceptance that seems to have the most positive effects. And when we talk about that neutral acceptance, that is, I guess, most closely associated with things like the Stoic philosopher's way of looking at death. This idea that I accept it as a natural part of life. I don't push it away. I don't embrace it. I accept it for what it is, and I try not to get too hung up on it, or I try not to let it distress me too much. So that's the kind of acceptance that in treatment it's useful to try and cultivate. And again, that can be through kind of cognitive challenging type strategies, reading different people's perspectives on it. I know I keep harping on about the Stoics, but I do find the writings of the Stoics really useful for this, and a lot of them, particularly Seneca, are really accessible and easy to read. So it does
even when you say Stoics, my apologies for interrupting. When you say Stoics, and in this theme of acceptance, bells ring in my head around acceptance and commitment therapy of sitting with the idea and sitting with the experience and understanding of death, that we are going to die. In some sense, we're dying. Even kind of including those other forms that, yes, it will also accept that it will take away some of the pains of this current life, and accepting that there could be, an afterlife, or even accepting that there might not be an afterlife. It's kind of acceptance at the core.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's about, doing what works for some people. For some people, the approach acceptance, that's going to be really helpful. For someone else, that's not going to be their cup of tea. Yes. So I think it's about doing what works. That neutral acceptance, fortunately, doesn't rely on either there being suffering now. So you'd be quite content with your life, not have much suffering to get, to want to escape from. So that escape acceptance isn't going to work for you. And it also doesn't rely on any kind of belief in an afterlife. So that's, I guess, one other reason why neutral acceptance is possibly the most effective. But I think, you mentioned acceptance and commitment therapy, and ACT has a couple of techniques that really are directly targeting fears of death, even though they're not quite framed in that light. So ACT has the eulogy task, which gets people to write their own eulogy, imagine their own funeral. So that's really clear exposure to death. And it's a really great task to do. People find it really transformative. And then they also have a kind of more condensed write your own tombstone inscription task. So in ACT, the purpose of that is to reflect on your values and move towards living a values-based, meaningful life. But those sort of tasks are really great, powerful exposure tasks for people who typically that's the last thing they're going to want to think about. And of course, those other benefits of using that image of your own funeral to think about, okay, what would I want people to say when I'm dead? What would I want, do I want people to talk about my academic success, my professional achievements, the fancy cars I owned, or do I want to hear people talking about she was a loving wife, he was a protective father, So yeah, ACT has a couple of really good tasks that I think CBT practitioners could benefit from drawing into their own work alongside the work they're already doing.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking, and even a playful space in that as well, where maybe the eulogy goes out and says, Nesh was a stubborn ass or something like that.
That's right. Whatever you want.
we always make it polite when this was actually happening, but I imagine there's some stuff between the lines as well that we can kind of hold lightly and laugh at.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
There's things to embrace about our life as well.
Definitely. And there's a lot of, I think humor is another really good thing that can help. So whether that's watching kind of comedies to do with death, like, Death at a Funeral, or like Monty Python has a lot of really great scenes with Grim Reapers and some of Woody Allen's films as well. But even there's this great book called Everybody Dies, a children's book for grown-ups by Ken Tanaka. And it's basically a picture book, but it's all about death. And the whole book is trying to put that kind of humorous spin on it. So it'll say things like, one person dies every 37 seconds. Are you still there? Or it'll make you kind of do fun activities such as matching the corpse to the cause of death, which sounds tremendously morbid, but the way the book presents it is in this really kind of playful, sort of silly spirit that, again, is just trying to get people to view it all a little differently and view it as something natural and something that it can be helpful to view lightly. That's not going to work for everyone. Sure. But I think, like you said, using humor where it's going to work for yourself is hugely helpful to change that perspective of it.
Yeah, I was watching Ricky Gervais, the comedian, recently. I think it was on 60 Minutes, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
And part of the interview was in a cemetery, and it was conducted there because he was talking about if we can't even if we can't go out and make fun of death, and dying, what's the point of humor? Like, isn't that what we want to use it for? To hold things lightly that way, and I think humor can also be quite useful. For those that are able to do that, but certainly, I'd encourage anyone to do that because I think humour, is helpful for lots of topics,
Definitely. Ricky Gervais, he did another interview. He must have it on the brain because he's been talking about it a lot. He did another interview
maybe he's got death anxiety.
Who knows what's going on for Ricky at the moment? But he did another interview on Conan O'Brien or Jimmy Fallon or something like that, and he said he had this great quote. He said. He outwardly came out and said, I'm not afraid of death, and then said, death is like being stupid. It's only painful for other people, or, something like that. It's not painful for you. It's only painful for those around you. And I thought that's such a great way of looking at it. It's a really humorous, view on this idea that you're not there when you're dead, so you're fine in that sense. But I think, looking at those, and Woody Allen has a few kind of similar really funny quotes about death. So borrowing from other people that can help change our perspective on it is really useful, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think he's just released a Netflix show called Afterlife, and so it's quite morbid about his wife passing away, and he's quite depressed, and it's got a lot of comedy weaved through it. So maybe that's the references to death that are coming up.
Yeah, that's probably right. Actually, I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but it's meant to be really good. I've heard good things about it.
Have you, since you've put this article out, have you heard, a lot of commentary come your way and kind of inquiring about death anxiety and kind of saying, oh, in actual fact, I've been experiencing this, or I've thought about this, or what's been the response for you?
It's been really popular. I mean, in some ways, it's quite a challenging idea. It's challenging a lot of our understanding of mental health as well as treatment. but it's funny, people seem to really be wanting to talk about it at the moment. Maybe that's kind of also related to other things in the media going on, like Ricky Gervais's TV show, but a lot of people have come forward and linked their own fears of death in with some other things that are going on for them. There's a bit of a zeitgeist at the moment in terms of the death positivity movement, which is essentially this idea that we need to start talking about death and thinking about death, and it's this movement largely driven by women. There's increasing popularity of things like death cafes, where people will, people hold regular death cafes at their local cafe, and you go and you chat about it with just strangers over, tea and cake and things.
I'm going to a death meeting.
Yeah, it's, people, again, sometimes I've had to tell people, oh, I'm so sorry, I can't make it that day, I've got death cafe. And you get some interesting looks and responses. But I think it is a sign, there does seem, for whatever reason, I don't know what started it, but there does seem to be this current kind of movement towards talking about death. Like, there have been so many books out in the last 5 years. There's been, Being Mortal, I've forgotten the name of that author, but Being Mortal, When Breath Becomes Air. Recently there was Advice for Future Corpses by Sally Tisdale. There have been a real kind of upsurge in death positivity related books and TV shows that I do think, in some ways, the article was just really well timed, that I think it came out around a time when death positivity was becoming a bit more commonplace and talked about. Which is fantastic. I think we need that kind of shift in the culture where death isn't something taboo anymore, because having it as taboo has a really serious impact on a lot of people, particularly people at the end of life, where they maybe don't feel comfortable having conversations with people about their end of life preferences. So I think anything that starts to open up those conversations and get people thinking about it and talking about it can only be helpful.
I love the idea. I mean, it's almost like, how do we hold death? And after someone does die, I've been to a number of funerals and wakes, and the wakes can be very, very different types of experiences. Some are quite morose and sad and painful, and others are all those things and a celebration. And so, and when I say celebration, like an outward celebration with music and people having a laugh and talking about old memories of the person and celebrating their life in a jovial way, probably like while that person was alive. So I love the idea of having this conversation, talking about it, because it's almost like from an early age where we're almost told that there's something wrong about death. That it's almost like it's not normal. It shouldn't happen. I know it's painful, but it's almost like we've connected because it's painful. It shouldn't happen.
Yeah, definitely. It's seen as a failure on behalf of the medical team or the hospital if someone dies, rather than a natural, inevitable thing. I think you're completely right. I think the way the rituals we have around death play a big role. And there's been some talk about how, in ancient Greece or ancient Egypt, there were really clear-cut rituals associated with what you do. So in Greece, women would scream and wail, and there'd be a set number of days for that. And the funeral would take place, in the city very publicly. It would be public mourning. It was something very open. In Egypt, I think people would shave their eyebrows, shave their heads. So there were these really specific rituals for what to do when someone dies. And it was really public. Even, within the last 100, 200 years, it was often the families who would play that role that, funeral homes now do, in terms of bathing the corpse, dressing the corpse, being there with the corpse for the days after death. And there's been people talking recently about this idea that currently where we're at now, we've kind of lost a lot of those rituals around death. And so I think there can be this sense of just not knowing how to cope when someone dies, because it has become taboo. It is something we don't talk about. And we've lost those kind of structured rituals that help people actually grieve after a loss. So I think you're completely right. The way we handle a loss, whether that's a celebration, whether that's more kind of somber, is going to have a big impact on the way we feel about death and feel about the loss of that loved one as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of in two minds, and I say so in two different spaces. And I've got a Serbian heritage, and part of the tradition, and my apologies because I don't know it 100% well, but after someone dies, for example, the spouse, the widow, dresses in black. And remains in black for a 12-month period. There's no music to be played in the house, so music is barred, I believe, for 40 days.
Wow.
You know, I think the men in the family don't shave at all, and I don't know what the religious reasons are or traditional reasons are for that, but you don't shave either for that period also. But it's almost like part of me kind of says, you know, it's nice to have tradition because if someone's in black, others can kind of reach out to them and they can know that this person's lost someone and they might be mourning or they're likely to be mourning. Part of it also kind of says when we stipulate, you know, time periods or when there's expectations around time periods, that might drag someone through 12 months of mourning when some might process it a little bit faster. And I don't know, I'm in two minds. About where tradition can be incredibly helpful and useful, and then sometimes it might go out and impede. And, you know, maybe it's one of those depends situations. But what are your thoughts?
I completely see what you mean. I guess, like you said, for some people, having those traditions gives them a way of, I guess in some ways can assist with that mourning process or grieving process, particularly with, you know, what you mentioned about things like black dress being a sign that communicates to others, you know, I'm grieving, I'm mourning, and other people are more likely to reach out or be sensitive towards that person. But I think you're right, you know, people shouldn't feel obliged to arbitrarily follow the traditions of their culture if that's something that does feel constraining or not helpful. I guess the main thing that I would think of is, regardless of the specific cultural traditions, this idea that at some times in history, people were much more open with talking about, you know, death and mourning and grieving. And I feel like to a certain extent that isn't around anymore. And, you know, I'm not one to sort of fall back on golden age or things were so much better in the past type thinking, but I think we do need to be wary of how we have become, you know, death has become so medicalized and kind of sequestered to hospitals, and death only happens in hospitals or in some cases at home, but it's not something typically we get a lot of exposure to nowadays. So I think it's just important to be able to talk about death, particularly when someone's lost a loved one. I think a lot of us don't know how to, you know, including myself, don't know how to talk to someone who's just lost someone they love. So I think, you're right. You know, tradition can be helpful, sometimes not helpful for other people. But I think the main thing is having that open conversation towards the end of life or also after a death as well.
I always have a thought in mind about how do you talk to someone, you know, who's lost someone, or how do you talk to anyone about a difficult conversation? And I often think about it. I think we just do it in a clumsy way. We go in and we just have the conversation. I don't know if there's a right way to approach someone and say, you know, I'm sorry to hear about your loss, or my condolences, or, you know, how you're feeling, how you're going. I think we just kind of clumsily walk into that room, you know, into that space and you know, reach out and offer a gentle open hand. And that's why I call it clumsy, because I don't think I ever know what I'm doing when trying to console someone, support someone. I just reach out as a friend, as a loved one, and you know. But because it's awkward, we tend to avoid it. You know, there's that avoidance sort of space again.
Exactly, I completely agree, and I think, you know, again, a lot of that clumsiness is because no one has told us, you know, it's not something we learn. We don't learn how to have these conversations with people. We don't talk about things to say or things not to say, you know, when there's been a death. And I think, you know, there is a lot of that avoidance. If we know that we're likely to be anxious about death, of course we're going to be anxious about having those kind of conversations. And it's even an issue in the medical field. There's a number of studies that show that medical professionals' own levels of death anxiety significantly predict the types of conversations they have with patients about end-of-life preferences, as well as the treatment options they give people. So practitioners, whether that's
Wow.
doctors, it's incredible. And again, it's not something people are typically consciously aware of, that, I would assume myself as a specialist would have a fair amount of rationality and logic when it comes to discussing treatment options with a patient. But my own fears of death seem to be getting in the way of that a lot of the time. So yeah, it's not something that's just specific to mental health. I think it seems to be affecting, this is a bit off topic, but even there's a great study coming from the field of terror management theory under social psychology. There's a really famous early study of terror management theory in the late 80s. Essentially, terror management theory, just briefly, argues that fears of death underlie a lot of human behavior, and the studies they do focus on reminding people of death and then measuring their behavior. And there were really early studies that showed that they had real US court judges. They reminded them of death, or they had a control condition. And then they gave the court judges a description of a sex worker who'd, broken the law, because sex work was illegal, and asked them to assign a bond to that criminal, to that person. And they found that the real US judges who had been reminded of death previously assigned a bond that was 9 times higher than those in the control condition. And these are real
9 times.
9 times higher. And these are people in the justice system. So it's one of those things that I think there's so much evidence. There are over 200 studies in terror management theory showing that our own fears of death affect our behavior in all kinds of ways that we're not aware of. So things like making us more racist towards other people. Reminders of death do that. They make us want to spend more money. In my own research relevant to mental health, reminders of death make people with OCD spend twice as long washing their hands compared to those in the control condition. So it's one of those really interesting things in psychology where people aren't even aware of this having an effect. When I ask the participants who had OCD if they knew what the study was about, no one had any idea it was to do with the reminders of death 20 minutes ago, but we're seeing these huge increases in washing behavior. I'm doing a study at the moment that I'm still recruiting for, so the results are in the really early stages, but essentially we're seeing that when patients are reminded of death, they spend significantly longer checking their body for signs of poor health. They're significantly more likely to say they'll visit their GP in the next 2 months. And they're also significantly more likely to see increased threat in their own body symptoms. So to see their
kind
own...
of like monitoring, like, oh, is that a bump, or what's that feeling, or that doesn't feel like the other side of my body, there must be something wrong. Is that what you mean? The monitoring?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's so many studies showing that our own thoughts of death impact our behavior. But it's not something a lot of us are, consciously aware of. And if you think about how that can be affecting things like the justice system, if US judges are subject to that sort of thing, 9 times so much higher for a bond. It's just crazy to think of how these kind of thoughts of death can be affecting us on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely incredible and fascinating to think about the applications of these types of studies. What comes to mind for me is, obviously, what's the antidote? What's the antidote to talking about death? We either go out and change our relationship with death so that we're not frightened by it and we have a reasonable relationship with it, that kind of approach, or that natural relationship. Or we spend some time in the gratitude, maybe. I'm not sure if that's the opposite, but appreciating the life parts. That's probably for another PhD. But how appreciation might change, bond amounts for sex workers or something. But it's fascinating how much this unconscious experience goes out and can push our behavior around.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, like you said, in terms of how to stop that happening, I think it's borrowing as many different tools from the toolbox as we can, whether that's acceptance. Gratitude is another really big one in terms of Instead of thinking it's so unfair that I have to die, why do people have to die? Actually having gratitude for the fact that we were born at all. No one guaranteed us this amazing opportunity of being alive on this planet. So shifting that from kind of frustration to gratitude. I think it's borrowing as many different tools as we can to help us come to terms with our mortality.
Yeah, I've heard in therapy and grief and loss sort of counselling and supporting clients, eventually they get towards that real acceptance and then being grateful for saying, I'm glad to have had Peter in my life for 36 years, and I'm lucky to have had those opportunities and those experiences and to have had kids and so on. So it shifts it from the loss to the appreciation and being grateful that they've had so many years and that they can continue to cherish those memories.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that can be a really helpful way of, reframing what is a tragic loss for a lot of people, trying to cultivate that acceptance, but also, gratitude, feeling fortunate that any of us have the time that we do with other people. No one's guaranteed to wake up tomorrow. We're fortunate to do so. And I think it's an important thing to be aware of, and something that a lot of us, myself included, tend to take for granted day to day.
Absolutely. Rachel, I really appreciate your time. I know that it would be lovely to be able to speak for hours, because I'm sure we could. How can people go out and get in touch with you, find out more about you?
So they could do so on my website, which is www.rachelmenzies.com. That has my email on there. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to be able to chat about all things death for this morning.
Oh, I know. Who would have thought that death can be so interesting, exciting, and stepping towards us? And I think my notification just told me that I'm going to die, so I better go out and appreciate the next moments ahead.
Yeah, that sounds good. Cherish your afternoon.
Thanks again for coming on, and stay well and healthy.
Thank you. Same to you. Thanks, Nesh.
Bye.
Bye.
Before you go out and leave, hit subscribe. It'll make the world of difference for me. If you've enjoyed this, there's plenty more to come.